Welcome to a slow, quiet journey into the coldest waters on Earth, where time stretches, movement softens, and life grows in ways that feel almost unreal. Beneath the Antarctic ice, the ocean becomes a place where silence is not empty, but full, and where the rules that shape life in warmer seas begin to loosen their grip. Tonight, we will drift gently into the Southern Ocean, the vast body of water that encircles Antarctica and connects the Atlantic, Pacific, and Indian Oceans into a single cold system. This is not a place of rushing currents or sudden change. The average water temperature here hovers just below freezing, often between -1.8 and 2 degrees Celsius. Cold enough to numb exposed skin in seconds, cold enough to slow chemical reactions, cold enough to reshape the very pace of life itself. And yet, in these extreme conditions, animals do not shrink away. Instead, many of them grow larger than their relatives anywhere else on Earth. As you settle into stillness, you might imagine the surface above, covered in drifting ice and long Antarctic nights, while far below, the water remains dark year-round. Sunlight fades within the first few hundred meters, and beneath that, the ocean becomes a realm guided not by day and night, but by temperature, pressure, and time, measured in centuries rather than moments. In these depths live giant sea spiders with leg spans wider than dinner plates, colossal Antarctic octopuses weighing hundreds of kilograms, enormous isopods the size of small dogs, and slow-moving starfish that can take decades to reach maturity. This phenomenon is known as Antarctic gigantism, and it has fascinated scientists for over a century. In colder water, oxygen dissolves more easily, allowing the ocean to carry higher concentrations of it. Cold temperatures also slow metabolism, meaning animals burn energy more slowly, age more gradually, and often live far longer than similar species in warmer seas. Some Antarctic invertebrates are known to live for 30, 50, even over 100 years, growing steadily over time instead of racing toward adulthood. In this environment, being large is not a disadvantage. It is an adaptation shaped by patience. As we move deeper, the pressure increases, squeezing gently but constantly, while the temperature remains almost unchanged. Unlike tropical oceans, where temperature drops rapidly with depth, the Antarctic water column is remarkably stable. This stability allows life to exist across wide depth ranges, from shallow shelves to abyssal plains thousands of meters below the surface. Food arrives slowly here, often drifting down as marine snow, tiny particles of organic matter falling from above. So creatures have evolved to move slowly, conserve energy, and make the most of every opportunity. You might imagine a giant Antarctic squid gliding through this darkness, its movements unhurried, its body adapted to cold muscles and slow nerve signals. Or a massive sea star spreading itself across the sea floor, feeding patiently, inch by inch. These animals are not built for speed or aggression. They are built for endurance, for surviving in an environment that changes very little over millions of years. As you breathe calmly, let the idea settle in that size here is not about dominance, but about balance. In cold water, bigger bodies lose heat more slowly. Larger cells function efficiently at low temperatures. Long lifespans allow organisms to grow without urgency. The Antarctic Ocean rewards stillness, and over evolutionary time, that stillness becomes scale. This journey is not about fear or extremes, but about quiet adaptation. The giants of the Antarctic are gentle reminders that life does not always respond to harshness by becoming smaller or faster. Sometimes, life responds by becoming slower, larger, and more deliberate. And as we continue this descent together, we will explore these giants not as monsters of the deep, but as calm, ancient residents of one of the most stable and patient environments on our planet. There is nothing you need to do right now but listen and drift. The cold water will carry us forward, softly, into a world where size is shaped by temperature. Time stretches thin, and the ocean teaches us that growth does not always require speed, only persistence, descending through layers of temperature. As we begin our slow descent into the cold waters of the Antarctic Ocean, let us first understand where we are going and what makes these waters so different from the tropical seas and temperate oceans that most people imagine when they think of the ocean. The ocean is not uniform in temperature, but is divided into layers, each with its own characteristics, its own collection of life forms, its own rules about how organisms can survive and thrive. At the surface, where sunlight penetrates and where the atmosphere touches the water, temperatures vary greatly depending on latitude and season. Near the equator, surface waters can be as warm as 30 degrees Celsius or more, bathwater warm, while near the poles they can be as cold as -2 degrees Celsius, hovering just above the freezing point of seawater, which is lower than the freezing point of pure water, because the salt dissolved in seawater depresses its freezing point. As we descend from the surface, we pass through a layer called the thermocline, a region where temperature drops rapidly with depth, sometimes by as much as 20 degrees over just a few hundred meters. Below the thermocline, in the deep ocean, temperatures stabilize at around 2 to 4 degrees Celsius in most parts of the world, cold and constant, a vast reservoir of near-freezing water that makes up most of the ocean's volume. But in the Antarctic, the temperature profile is different, for here the surface waters themselves are already near freezing, hovering around -1 or -2 degrees Celsius year-round. And as we descend, the temperature remains cold all the way down, with only small variations, creating an environment where every living thing, from the surface to the seafloor, thousands of meters below, must cope with temperatures that would kill most organisms from warmer waters within hours or days. This extreme cold has profound effects on biology, on chemistry, on physics, on everything that happens in these waters. And understanding these effects is the key to understanding why Antarctic animals grow to such extraordinary sizes. The physics of cold water. Let us drift for a moment in these frigid Antarctic waters and consider what cold means at the most fundamental level. What happens to water molecules and to the substances dissolved in water when temperature drops toward freezing? Temperature is a measure of the average kinetic energy of molecules, how fast they are moving and vibrating on average. And when water is cold, its molecules are moving more slowly, colliding with each other less frequently and with less energy. This has several important consequences that affect everything living in the water. First, cold water is denser than warm water, for the slower-moving molecules pack together more tightly, though this trend reverses very close to freezing due to the way hydrogen bonds arrange themselves in nearly frozen water. Second, cold water holds more dissolved gases than warm water, particularly oxygen and carbon dioxide, for gases dissolve more readily in cold liquids where the energetic collisions that would normally drive them back out of solution are reduced. This means that Antarctic waters are oxygen-rich, often containing 50% more dissolved oxygen per liter than tropical waters at the same depth, a fact that has profound implications for the metabolism and size of Antarctic animals. Third, chemical reactions proceed more slowly in cold water, for reaction rates generally double with every 10-degree increase in temperature, which means that a reaction at 0 degrees Celsius proceeds roughly 8 times slower than the same reaction at 30 degrees, all else being equal. This affects not just metabolism, the chemical processes that living things use to extract energy from food and build new tissues, but also processes like decay and decomposition, which proceed much more slowly in Antarctic waters than in warmer seas. Fourth, cold water is more viscous than warm water, meaning it is thicker and resists flow more strongly, like honey compared to water, though the difference is much smaller than that comparison suggests. For organisms swimming through water, this increased viscosity means slightly more resistance, slightly more energy required to move at the same speed, a small effect, but one that adds up over the lifetime of an animal, and that influences the evolution of body shapes and swimming strategies. What gigantism means in the deep. Before we can understand why cold water makes animals huge, we must first understand what we mean by gigantism in the context of Antarctic marine life. For the phenomenon is more subtle and more interesting than simply saying that everything in the Antarctic is bigger. Gigantism in Antarctic waters refers specifically to the tendency of certain groups of animals to grow much larger than their relatives in warmer waters, sometimes twice as large, sometimes 10 times as large, occasionally even larger than that. This does not mean that every Antarctic animal is huge, for there are plenty of small creatures in these cold waters, microscopic plankton and tiny crustaceans and small fish that are no larger than their warm water cousins. Rather, it means that for certain groups of animals, particularly invertebrates like sea spiders and isopods and amphipods and sea snails, the maximum size reached in Antarctic waters far exceeds what is seen anywhere else in the world's oceans. A sea spider in tropical waters might be a few centimeters across, small enough to fit on your fingernail. But in the Antarctic, sea spiders can span 30 centimeters or more, as large as a dinner plate, with legs as thick as pencils. An isopod, a type of crustacean related to the pill bugs you might find under a rock in your garden, is typically 1 or 2 centimeters long in most oceans. But the giant Antarctic isopod can reach 15 centimeters or more, the size of a small cat. An amphipod, another crustacean often called a scud or side swimmer, is usually less than a centimeter long. But Antarctic amphipods can grow to 10 centimeters, almost as large as a human hand. Even more dramatically, sea snails and sea slugs that are typically small and inconspicuous in warmer waters can grow enormous in the Antarctic, with some species reaching sizes 20 or 30 times larger than their temperate relatives. This pattern of polar gigantism is not unique to the Antarctic, but is seen in Arctic waters as well, and to some extent in the deep sea, where temperatures are also near freezing, suggesting that cold water itself is the key factor driving these size increases. The oxygen advantage theory, one of the most compelling explanations for why cold water produces giant animals, is the oxygen advantage theory, which proposes that the high levels of dissolved oxygen in cold water remove one of the primary constraints that normally limits animal size in warmer waters. To understand this theory, we must first understand how oxygen delivery works in animals and why size matters. All animals need oxygen to power their metabolism, to fuel the chemical reactions that break down food molecules and release the energy stored in them. Small animals have an easier time obtaining oxygen than large animals because their surface area is large relative to their volume, a consequence of the mathematical fact that surface area scales with the square of linear dimension, while volume scales with the cube. A sphere with radius 1 has a surface area of about 12.5 and a volume of about 4, giving a surface-to-volume ratio of about 3. Double the radius to 2, and the surface area becomes 50, while volume becomes 33, giving a ratio of only 1.5, half as much surface relative to volume. This principle applies to animals as well, and it means that as animals get larger, their surface area, through which oxygen must diffuse or across which gills or lungs must extract oxygen from water or air, grows more slowly than their volume, which determines how much oxygen they need. At some point, an animal can become so large that its gills or respiratory surfaces cannot extract enough oxygen to supply the needs of all its tissues. And this sets a maximum size beyond which the animal cannot grow without fundamentally redesigning its body plan. In warm water, where dissolved oxygen levels are relatively low, this constraint becomes limiting at smaller sizes. But in cold Antarctic waters, where dissolved oxygen levels are much higher, animals can grow larger before they hit this limit. The oxygen advantage theory suggests that Antarctic giants have taken advantage of this abundance of oxygen to grow to sizes that would be impossible in warmer waters, where oxygen is scarcer. Metabolic slowdown and energy conservation. Drifting deeper into our understanding of Antarctic gigantism, let us now consider another important factor: the metabolic slowdown that occurs in cold water and how this affects the energy budgets of animals living there. Metabolism is the sum of all chemical reactions occurring in an organism, the breaking down of food molecules to release energy and the building up of new tissues and molecules from simpler components. And like all chemical reactions, metabolic reactions are sensitive to temperature. As we mentioned earlier, chemical reaction rates roughly double with every 10-degree increase in temperature, which means that an animal living in water at 30 degrees Celsius has a metabolic rate approximately 8 times higher than a similar animal living at 0 degrees, all else being equal. This is a dramatic difference, and it has profound implications for how much food an animal needs to eat to survive and grow. A warm water animal must eat constantly, processing food continuously to generate enough energy to power its high metabolic rate. But a cold water animal can survive on much less food, for its metabolic machinery is running in slow motion, requiring only a fraction of the energy input. This slower metabolism is both a constraint and an opportunity. It is a constraint because it means that Antarctic animals move more slowly, grow more slowly, reproduce more slowly, and generally live their lives at a pace that would seem almost glacial to a tropical organism. It is an opportunity because it means that the limited food resources available in the Antarctic, where productivity is concentrated in brief summer blooms and where much of the year is dark and unproductive, can support larger animals than would be possible if those animals had the energy demands of their warm water relatives. An Antarctic giant isopod does not need to eat every day, perhaps not even every week, for its slow metabolism allows it to survive on infrequent meals, storing energy efficiently and using it sparingly, living a life of patient waiting, punctuated by occasional feasts when food becomes available. Descending through layers of temperature. As we begin, let us imagine that we are not simply reading or listening, but drifting, as if our body has become weightless, as if gravity has loosened its grip and we are free to sink through water the way a snowflake sinks through still air. The surface world is still above us, bright and busy, but already it feels far away. Down here, the ocean begins to rearrange time. It slows it. It stretches it. It turns minutes into something softer, something closer to the long, steady patience of the planet itself. To understand why cold water makes animals huge, we have to begin with something that seems simple, almost too ordinary to matter. Temperature. Not temperature as a quick weather report, not the number you see on a phone screen, but temperature as an invisible architecture in the sea, shaping where life can live, how fast it can move, and how much energy it can spend just to exist. The ocean is not one uniform body of water. It is layered, stratified, arranged in subtle bands and gradients that you cannot see with your eyes, but that organisms feel with every cell of their bodies. Near the equator, the surface can be astonishingly warm, sometimes close to 30 degrees Celsius, a layer heated by relentless sunlight and mixed by wind. In temperate regions, the surface breathes with the seasons, warming in summer, cooling in winter, never quite stable. But around Antarctica, the surface begins where much of the deep ocean ends. The water can hover near the freezing point of seawater, close to -1.8 degrees Celsius, because salt lowers the temperature at which water crystallizes into ice. Here, cold is not an occasional event. It is an identity. It is the permanent condition. In many parts of the world, if you descend from the surface, you pass through a region called the thermocline, where the temperature drops quickly, as if you are moving through an invisible curtain. Warm water stays above because it is lighter. Cold water sinks because it is denser. The thermocline is the boundary between those realities, and on one side of it, the ocean feels like a living skin, sunlit and energetic, while on the other side, it becomes the deep reservoir of cold that fills most of the planet's ocean volume. Below that, temperatures in much of the deep sea settle into a narrow range around 2 to 4 degrees Celsius, quiet and steady. But in the Antarctic, the thermocline is less like a cliff and more like a slope that has already been descended. The surface itself is near freezing, and so the descent does not bring a dramatic drop from warm to cold. It brings variations within cold. It brings slight shifts, subtle differences between -1 and +1. The kind of differences that to us would seem negligible. But to enzymes and membranes and metabolism can mean the difference between thriving and failing. This matters because most animals in the sea are ectotherms. Their internal temperature is not maintained by burning fuel the way mammals do. Their bodies are shaped by the water they live in. In warm seas, life can run fast. In cold seas, life runs slow, unless it has evolved special ways to resist that slowing. And Antarctica is not just cold. It is persistently cold. Cold not just at the bottom, but across enormous vertical distances. That means entire communities evolve within the same thermal mood, generation after generation. The way a culture evolves under a stable climate. As we sink deeper in the imagination, sunlight fades quickly. In the first few hundred meters, even in clear water, brightness declines. And in the polar winter, it can feel as if the surface itself is already night. Beneath the reach of meaningful light, life becomes less about vision and more about chemistry, touch, vibration, scent. The sea is no longer an open, bright field. It becomes a three-dimensional darkness where each movement costs energy, and where energy is the most precious currency. Here, the cold begins to feel less like an obstacle and more like a sculptor. Cold affects the fluidity of membranes. It affects how quickly molecules bump into each other. It affects how quickly food can be processed into usable energy. It affects how quickly wounds heal and how quickly eggs develop. It affects how quickly an animal can grow. And growth in the Antarctic is often slow, not because life is weak, but because life is patient. It is as if organisms have decided, through evolution, that rushing is not the point. The world above the surface rushes. The atmosphere changes hourly. Storms appear and vanish. But down here, water temperature is stable enough that an individual animal may live an entire lifetime without ever experiencing a warm day. This is why the Antarctic can produce giants. Not because it is a fantasy realm, but because it offers the one resource most ecosystems cannot: time. In a warm ecosystem, growth is often fast, but so is the cost of living. In a cold ecosystem, the cost of living can be lower in some ways, and the pace of life can stretch out. A creature that lives longer has more time to grow. A creature that moves slower can conserve energy. A creature that does not burn through resources quickly can afford a larger body. So in this first chapter, we let the cold establish itself not as a villain, but as the background music. We let the ocean's layers become a quiet map. We let the Antarctic be what it is. A place where the surface and the depths share the same chill, and where evolution has had millions of years to explore what happens when cold is constant. And now, as we drift further, we can begin to ask the deeper question: what does cold actually do to water itself? To the physics of the medium that holds and carries life. Because to understand Antarctic giants, we have to understand not only the animals, but the water that makes them possible. The physics of cold water. Cold is not just a feeling in the skin. In the ocean, cold is a shift in the behavior of molecules, a change in the tempo of the invisible dance that underlies everything. Water at near freezing temperatures is still water, still the same familiar substance, but it behaves differently in ways that ripple outward into biology and ecology, shaping what kinds of bodies can exist, how they breathe, and how they spend energy. Temperature is a measure of the average kinetic energy of molecules. When water is warm, molecules move faster, colliding more often, carrying more energy in each collision. When water is cold, the movement slows. Collisions become less energetic. The entire system feels calmer, not emotionally, but physically. It is a quieter molecular world. One consequence is density. In general, cold water is denser than warm water because the molecules pack closer together when they move more slowly. This is why cold water sinks beneath warm water and why the ocean stratifies into layers. Near freezing, water becomes more complicated because hydrogen bonds create structures that change density trends. But in seawater, the story is dominated by salinity and temperature together. The Southern Ocean becomes a dense, heavy mass that can sink and spread, feeding deep currents that circulate across the globe like slow, invisible rivers. Another consequence is the behavior of dissolved gases. Cold water can hold more gas than warm water. Oxygen dissolves more readily when temperature is low, because the reduced molecular motion makes it less likely for dissolved gas molecules to escape back into the atmosphere. That means the Antarctic can be a place where oxygen availability is higher than in warm seas, not uniformly everywhere, not always in the same proportion, but often enough that it becomes a major feature of the environment. Oxygen in the ocean is not just a chemical. It is a limit. For animals, oxygen is the gateway to energy. Without oxygen, aerobic metabolism cannot run. And aerobic metabolism is what makes large bodies possible. A warm water environment can be rich in life. But because warm water holds less dissolved oxygen, and because warm temperatures accelerate metabolic demands, organisms may face a double squeeze. Less oxygen available while needing more oxygen to sustain the same tissue. In cold water, the squeeze can relax. More oxygen can be available while metabolic pace slows. This does not guarantee gigantism, but it creates an opening, a possibility space, where some body plans can push larger before they hit the ceiling of oxygen delivery. Cold also slows chemical reactions in general. Many reaction rates increase with temperature, often approximated by the idea that reactions can speed up substantially with each 10-degree rise, though real biology is more nuanced. Still, the basic truth stands. The chemistry of life runs slower in the cold. This affects digestion, movement, development, reproduction, immune response, and growth. It also affects decay and decomposition. Organic matter can persist longer. Carcasses may remain available as food for longer periods, creating a different rhythm of feast and scarcity. Cold water is also slightly more viscous than warm water. Viscosity is a measure of how strongly a fluid resists flow. In colder water, molecules cling a bit more strongly to each other, so movement through water can require slightly more effort. For small organisms, viscosity can feel like living in syrup compared to what a larger animal feels, because at small scales, viscosity dominates over inertia. This shapes the movement strategies of plankton and tiny larvae. It also influences which shapes are efficient for swimming and drifting. Then there is pressure, which increases with depth regardless of temperature. In the Antarctic, many animals live across wide depth ranges in consistently cold water. Pressure can affect proteins and membranes, and deep-sea organisms evolve adaptations to function under crushing force. Yet the Antarctic shelf also contains cold, shallow habitats that mimic deep-sea thermal conditions without the same pressure. This creates a fascinating overlap. Cold-adapted creatures can exist at depths where they might otherwise only be found far deeper in warmer oceans. In other words, the Antarctic can bring deep sea conditions upward. Cold, stable water can make a continental shelf feel like an abyss in terms of temperature, even if sunlight seasonally touches it. That blending of realms may be one reason polar ecosystems produce unusual size patterns and unusual community structures. Antarctic giants. The physics creates opportunities, but evolution chooses where to spend them, and different lineages respond differently depending on their body plan, their ecology, their history. So in this chapter, we let the physics settle into our mind like cold water settling into a basin. We let the idea form that the medium itself is different here. The Antarctic is not only cold, it is a whole package of linked physical effects. Oxygen patterns, reaction speeds, viscosity, density, circulation, pressure, stability. And once we understand the medium, we can ask the next gentle question. What exactly do we mean when we say gigantism? Because if we don't define the word carefully, it becomes a vague myth rather than a measurable pattern. What gigantism means in the deep. Gigantism, in this context, is not a fairy tale. It is not simply that everything in Antarctica is bigger. It is a pattern, uneven and selective, where certain groups reach sizes that far exceed what they achieve elsewhere. Your script already sets this up beautifully, emphasizing that plenty of Antarctic organisms are small and ordinary-sized, while particular invertebrate lineages grow remarkably large. Antarctic giants. That distinction matters because it shifts the story from exaggeration into a quieter, more interesting truth. Evolution does not apply one rule to all. It experiments, and only some experiments become giants. So let us define polar gigantism as a tendency for some polar species, often invertebrates, to reach larger maximum body sizes than closely related species in warmer waters. The key phrase is closely related. A whale is bigger than a sea spider, but whales are not evidence of polar gigantism. They are a separate lineage with its own story. Polar gigantism is about comparing apples to apples. Sea spiders in Antarctica versus sea spiders in temperate seas. Amphipods in Antarctic waters versus amphipods elsewhere. Isopods, snails, starfish, worms, and other groups that appear scaled up in the cold. The reason this matters is that size is never just size. Size is a way of living. A larger animal can store more energy. It can travel farther on a single tank. It can withstand longer starvation. It can produce larger offspring. It can resist predators by being difficult to handle. It can also, depending on the organism, filter more water, capture larger prey, and dominate certain ecological roles. But size also comes with costs. A larger body demands more oxygen, more nutrients, more structural support. It can be slower to reproduce. It can be harder to hide. In warm oceans, Where predators are diverse and metabolic pace is fast, those costs may outweigh the benefits for many lineages. In Antarctica, some of those costs soften. Predation patterns differ. Metabolic pace slows. Oxygen availability can be relatively favorable. Food arrives in pulses, and a larger body can ride out the lean seasons. When you describe sea spiders reaching dinner plate leg spans, that image works because sea spider anatomy is already a kind of extreme minimalism. Long legs, tiny central body, organs extending into appendages. In cold, oxygen-rich conditions, a body plan like that may be able to stretch farther before diffusion limits bite. The sea spider becomes a living demonstration of how form and environment interact. When you describe giant isopods and amphipods, the ecological story becomes clearer. These are scavengers and opportunists in a world where food can be patchy and seasonal. Your script later captures this beautifully with the feast or famine rhythm of carcass falls and long fasting. When you describe giant snails and slow-growing filter feeders, you are pointing to another dimension: longevity. In cold ecosystems, some organisms live longer and therefore have more time to grow. That does not mean everything becomes huge, but it means the upper boundary of size can creep upward over a long lifespan. If the organism survives long enough, and if growth continues incrementally. There is also a subtle psychological trap in gigantism stories. We tend to focus on the biggest examples because they are memorable. The camera seeks the extremes. The brain remembers them. But the ecosystem is mostly made of the ordinary. Gigantism is a spice, not the entire meal. This is a wonderful thing for a sleep documentary because it allows you to alternate between awe and calm, between a rare giant and the vast, quiet background that supports it. So in this chapter, we let gigantism become precise. We let it be a word that points to measurable differences in body size and to the ecological and physiological reasons those differences might evolve. We also allow room for uncertainty. Scientists debate mechanisms. They test hypotheses. They look for correlations between oxygen, temperature, predation, and food. They examine how lineages differ. The oxygen advantage theory. If there is one quiet law that runs beneath the surface of this story, it is that large bodies are expensive in oxygen. Every cell that uses aerobic metabolism must receive oxygen, and the problem of delivering oxygen becomes harder as organisms grow. This is not a dramatic, cinematic crisis. It is a slow mathematical truth, and it shapes the possible forms of life the way gravity shapes the possible forms of planets. This means that the interface through which oxygen can be absorbed grows more slowly than the mass of tissue that needs oxygen. It is one of the reasons why many large animals evolve complex respiratory and circulatory systems. Gills with enormous surface area, lungs folded into intricate branching networks, hearts that pump, blood that carries gases. But many marine invertebrates rely heavily on diffusion or on comparatively simple respiratory structures. For them, oxygen supply can become a ceiling on size, especially in warm water where oxygen levels are lower and metabolic demands are higher. The oxygen advantage theory proposes that cold water, by holding more dissolved oxygen, relaxes that ceiling. It does not remove the geometry. It does not change the square-cube relationship, but it changes the environment the organism breathes in. If the surrounding water carries more oxygen, diffusion gradients can be steeper. If oxygen is more available, an animal may not need to invest as much in specialized structures to support a given size. The design space widens. The direction is correct, but the percentage varies widely. A calm way to fix it without breaking your style is to say, cold. Antarctic water can hold substantially more dissolved oxygen than warm tropical water, And for some animals, that difference can be biologically meaningful. Now let us imagine this difference as a gentle metaphor. Think of oxygen like quiet wealth in the water, not something you see, but something that makes growth affordable. In a warm sea, oxygen can be like a tight budget. In a cold sea, it can be like a larger budget with slower spending. The organism can buy a bit more tissue before it becomes oxygen poor. But oxygen alone does not guarantee gigantism. A habitat can have oxygen and still not produce giants if food is too scarce, if predators are too intense, if life histories favor small, fast reproduction, or if the lineage's body plan cannot scale up effectively. Oxygen advantage is a necessary ingredient for some giants, but not a single master switch. There is also an important nuance. Oxygen in the ocean is shaped not only by temperature, but by circulation and productivity. Some cold waters can be oxygen-rich because they are well mixed and newly ventilated. Other places can be oxygen-poor even if they are cold. If circulation is sluggish, or if decomposition consumes oxygen faster than it is replenished. The Southern Ocean, with its strong circulation and deep water formation, often plays a major role in global oxygenation patterns. But the specifics vary by region, season, and depth. So the oxygen advantage theory should be presented as a strong and plausible explanation, not as a final verdict. That actually improves your script because it keeps the tone scientific and humble, and it lets the viewer relax into uncertainty rather than feeling they must memorize a single answer. Now, the most beautiful part is how oxygen ties into the next chapter. Because in the Antarctic, it is not only that oxygen can be more available, it is also that life may demand less oxygen per unit time, because cold slows metabolism. And when availability rises while demand falls, the gap between the two can become wide enough for giants to slip through. Metabolic slowdown and energy conservation. In warm water, life can feel fast even when you cannot see it. Cells divide quickly. Enzymes work at a lively pace. Muscles contract efficiently. Food is burned rapidly. Growth can be quick, but the cost of living is high. A warm water animal often must keep eating, keep moving, keep maintaining itself in a world where chemical reactions are naturally eager. Cold changes that eagerness. In the Antarctic, many organisms live in what feels like biological slow motion. The chemistry of the body, the breaking down of food, and the building of tissues runs at a gentler pace. Your script captures this with the common rule of thumb that many reaction rates increase with temperature, and that warmer environments often accelerate metabolic processes. Antarctic giants, even though biology is more complex than a simple doubling rule, the core truth is still soothingly clear. Cold slows things down. This slowdown has consequences that can look like disadvantages. Slower movement, slower growth, slower reproduction. But it also has consequences that look like gifts. Lower energy demand, longer survival during scarcity, the possibility of long lifespans. In a world where food can be seasonal, bursting in summer blooms and thinning during long winters, being able to survive without constant feeding is an enormous advantage. Here is where size begins to make a different kind of sense. A larger body can store more energy. It can build thicker reserves. It can endure longer fasting. In ecosystems where meals are unpredictable, this can favor bigger individuals, especially if the environment also reduces the cost of maintaining that bigger body. So we can imagine the Antarctic as a place where animals can afford to be large, not because resources are endless, but because the rate of spending is low. A slow metabolism is like a bank account with slow withdrawals. You can last longer between deposits. This is why your later imagery of scavengers and carcass falls works so well. In the deep sea and in polar waters, food can arrive as sudden, massive gifts, like a whale fall, and then vanish again. An animal that can gorge and then wait has an advantage. A larger animal can gorge more and wait longer. Metabolic slowdown also ties into growth. In warm environments, many organisms race through life, reproducing early and often, because mortality can be high and competition intense. In cold environments, where life may be slower and some lineages experience different predator pressures, organisms can shift toward longer development and longevity. That gives a creature not only time to grow, but also a reason to grow if larger size improves survival across long spans of scarcity and cold. It also changes the emotional texture of the ecosystem. In a warm reef, everything seems to flicker with urgency. In the Antarctic, the ecosystem feels calm, not because nothing happens, but because everything happens on a slower clock. This is perfect for your channel style, because it turns physiology into atmosphere. The biology itself creates the sleep-friendly pace. Now, metabolic slowdown is not the whole explanation, just as oxygen advantage is not the whole explanation. But together, they form a powerful pairing. Oxygen may be relatively abundant, metabolic demand may be relatively restrained. Food may be patchy, larger bodies may buffer scarcity. Predation may be different, large size may be less costly. Buoyancy supports big forms. The ocean makes giants physically possible in a way land does not. The pressure of predation. As we continue our slow drift through the cold Antarctic waters, floating gently past kelp forests and rocky reefs covered in colorful invertebrates, let us consider another factor that may contribute to the evolution of gigantism in these waters. The reduced pressure from predators compared to warmer, more diverse ecosystems. In tropical and temperate seas, the oceans are teeming with predators of all sizes and types. Fish and crustaceans and mollusks and countless other animals that make their living by hunting and eating other organisms. This intense predation pressure creates a strong selective force favoring smaller size in many animals. For small animals can hide more easily in crevices and under rocks, can reproduce more quickly to replace losses to predation, and can often escape notice by being inconspicuous. But in the Antarctic, the diversity of predators is lower than in warmer waters, a consequence of the extreme environmental conditions that limit which species can survive here. There are predators, of course, seals and penguins, and fish and giant predatory amphipods, but the overall predation pressure is thought to be lower than in more diverse ecosystems, and this may relax the selective pressure against large size. If an animal does not need to worry as much about being eaten, it can afford to grow larger, to become more visible, to move more slowly, all of which might be disadvantageous in a predator-rich environment, but which may be acceptable or even advantageous in the relatively predator-poor Antarctic. Additionally, larger size itself can be a defense against predation. For a truly giant invertebrate may simply be too large for most predators to handle, too big to swallow whole and too tough to break apart, effectively escaping predation by outgrowing the size range that predators can exploit. This creates a potential feedback loop where reduced predation pressure allows animals to grow larger, and larger size further reduces predation risk, driving the evolution of ever larger body sizes in certain lineages. The cold water sea spiders. Let us focus now on one of the most remarkable examples of Antarctic gigantism, the sea spiders. Strange arthropods that look like something from an alien world. All legs and no body, moving slowly across the sea floor on legs that seem impossibly thin and delicate. Sea spiders, which are not true spiders but rather belong to their own class of arthropods called pycnogonida. are found in oceans all over the world. But nowhere do they reach the sizes seen in the Antarctic. A typical sea spider in temperate or tropical waters has a leg span of perhaps a few centimeters at most. A tiny creature easily overlooked among the more conspicuous marine life. But Antarctic sea spiders can have leg spans exceeding 30 centimeters, as large as a dinner plate, with some specimens reaching even larger sizes. These giants move slowly across the seafloor, their long, thin legs stepping carefully among rocks and corals and sponges. Their tiny bodies suspended above the substrate like the center of a daddy longlegs, but multiplied in scale. The body of a sea spider is so reduced, so minimized, that it can barely contain the animal's internal organs. And in fact, it cannot, for the digestive system of a sea spider extends down into its legs, each leg containing a branch of the gut where food is processed and nutrients absorbed. This bizarre anatomy is taken to an extreme in the giant Antarctic species, where the legs are so long and the body so small that virtually all of the animal's internal volume is located in its appendages rather than its central body. Sea spiders are carnivores, feeding primarily on soft-bodied invertebrates like sea anemones and bryozoans and hydroids, which they pierce with a long proboscis and then suck out the internal fluids and tissues, leaving behind an empty shell. In the slow-motion world of the Antarctic seafloor, where temperatures hover just above freezing and where metabolic rates are low, these giant sea spiders can afford to be patient hunters, waiting motionless for hours or days until prey comes within reach, then slowly extending their proboscis and feeding leisurely on their catch. The mystery of sea spider respiration, one of the most intriguing mysteries surrounding Antarctic sea spiders, is how they manage to breathe. How they deliver oxygen to their tissues without any specialized respiratory organs at all. Sea spiders lack gills, lack lungs, lack any obvious structures for gas exchange, and yet they clearly obtain oxygen from the surrounding water and deliver it to their cells. For they are active animals that move and feed and grow and reproduce. The answer appears to lie in their unusual body plan and in the physics of diffusion in cold, oxygen-rich water. Because sea spiders have such a high surface area to volume ratio, with their bodies and internal organs spread out into long, thin legs, oxygen can diffuse directly from the surrounding water through their thin cuticle and into their tissues without needing to travel very far. In warm water, where oxygen levels are lower and metabolic rates are higher, this simple diffusion would likely be insufficient, and the deep tissues in the center of the legs would become oxygen-starved, limiting how thick the legs could be, and thus how large the animal could grow. But in the cold, oxygen-rich waters of the Antarctic, diffusion is apparently sufficient, for oxygen is abundant and the animal's oxygen demand is low due to its slow metabolism, creating a situation where passive diffusion alone can supply the needs of even a very large sea spider. This is a beautiful example of how multiple factors work together to enable gigantism. For it is not just the high oxygen levels alone, nor just the low metabolism alone, but the combination of the two that allows these animals to function without specialized respiratory organs and to grow to sizes that would be impossible under other conditions. Recent research has also suggested that Antarctic sea spiders may circulate their body fluids by the action of their digestive system, which undergoes rhythmic contractions that move fluids through the gut branches in the legs, effectively creating a simple circulatory system that helps distribute oxygen and nutrients even in the absence of a heart or specialized blood vessels. Giant isopods of the Antarctic anthos. Continuing our gentle descent through the layers of Antarctic marine life, let us turn our attention now to another group of remarkable giants, the isopods, crustaceans that live on and in the seafloor and that can reach sizes in the Antarctic that seem almost absurd for animals that are typically small and inconspicuous elsewhere in the world. Isopods belong to the same group of crustaceans as pillbugs and sobugs. Those gray armored creatures that roll up into balls when disturbed and that live in damp places on land. But most isopods are marine, living in the ocean where they scavenge on dead organic matter and occasionally prey on small living animals. In most parts of the world, marine isopods are small, usually less than a few centimeters long. But in the Antarctic and in the deep sea, some isopods grow to remarkable sizes. With the giant Antarctic isopod Glyptonotus antarcticus reaching lengths of up to 15 centimeters or more, about the size of a large rat, and related deep-sea species growing even larger. These giant isopods are heavily armored, their bodies covered in overlapping plates of tough cuticle that protect them from predators and from the physical stresses of their environment. They move slowly across the seafloor on 7 pairs of legs, their antennae sweeping ahead of them to detect chemical cues from food sources, for in the darkness of the deep Antarctic waters, vision is of limited use, and most animals rely on smell and touch to navigate and find food. Giant isopods are opportunistic feeders, eating whatever organic matter they encounter. From the carcasses of dead fish and seals to clumps of algae that drift down from the surface, from fecal pellets produced by animals higher in the water column, to the bodies of other invertebrates that have died and settled to the bottom. Their slow metabolism allows them to survive on infrequent meals, and studies have shown that giant isopods can go weeks or even months without eating. If food is scarce, their bodies subsisting on stored reserves and their activity reduced to a minimum to conserve energy. Reproduction and life history in slow motion. As we drift quietly through the cold waters, observing these giant isopods moving slowly across the seafloor, let us consider how their life histories differ from those of their smaller warm water relatives. For the slowdown in metabolism that comes with living in near freezing water affects not just feeding and movement, but every aspect of an organism's life cycle. In warm waters, many isopods reproduce quickly, reaching sexual maturity within a few months and producing multiple broods of offspring each year, a strategy that allows them to take advantage of abundant resources and to quickly rebuild populations after disturbances. But in the Antarctic, life proceeds at a much slower pace. Giant Antarctic isopods take several years to reach sexual maturity, growing slowly as they accumulate the energy and body mass needed to reproduce. When they do reproduce, females produce relatively few eggs, but those eggs are large and yolk-rich, providing each developing embryo with substantial energy reserves that allow it to develop into a relatively large juvenile before it must begin feeding on its own. The eggs are brooded by the female in a pouch on her underside, kept safe and supplied with oxygen as they develop over a period of months, much longer than the weeks or days typical of warm water species. When the young finally emerge, they are miniature versions of the adults, already well-formed and ready to begin their slow lives on the seafloor. And they will continue growing for many years, perhaps decades, before they themselves reach maturity and reproduce. This slow life history is typical of many Antarctic animals, from the smallest invertebrates to the largest fish, and it reflects the fundamental constraint imposed by cold water and low metabolic rates. A constraint that forces Antarctic life to adopt strategies of patience and longevity rather than rapid growth and quick reproduction. The colossal sea snails. Let us now turn our attention to yet another group of Antarctic giants, the sea snails, mollusks that have taken advantage of the cold, oxygen-rich waters to grow to sizes that dwarf their relatives in warmer seas. One of the most impressive examples is Neobuccinum etoni, a predatory sea snail that can reach shell lengths of 15 centimeters or more, enormous for a snail and far larger than most of its relatives in temperate and tropical waters. These giant snails move slowly across the sea floor, using their large muscular foot to glide over rocks and sediment. Their movement's so gradual that you could watch one for hours and barely see it change position. They are carnivores, feeding primarily on other mollusks and on soft-bodied invertebrates like sea cucumbers, which they attack with a radula, a tongue-like organ covered in rows of tiny teeth that can rasp and tear through tough tissues. The feeding process is slow and methodical, taking hours or even days to fully consume a large prey item. But this is perfectly suited to the snail's slow metabolism and to the cold environment where nothing happens quickly. Another remarkable Antarctic sea snail is Trophon, a genus that includes numerous species adapted to the extreme conditions of the Southern Ocean, some of which grow to impressive sizes and display beautiful shell shapes with elaborate spines and ridges that serve as protection against predators and as structural reinforcement for the shell. These snails lay their eggs in protective capsules attached to rocks or other hard surfaces, and the embryos develop slowly over many months. Their development synchronized with the Antarctic seasons so that juveniles emerge during the brief summer period when food is most abundant. The longevity of these giant snails is remarkable, with some individuals living for decades, their shells recording their life history in growth rings, much like a tree records its age in annual rings. And by studying these growth rings, scientists can reconstruct the environmental conditions that the snail experienced over its lifetime, learning about temperature fluctuations and food availability and other factors that influenced its growth. The physics of buoyancy and body structure. Drifting now through slightly deeper waters, let us consider another physical factor that affects the evolution of body size in Antarctic waters: the relationship between buoyancy and body structure. For in water, unlike on land, animals do not need to support their entire weight against gravity, but instead are supported by the buoyant force of the surrounding fluid. This has important implications for how large an animal can grow and what sorts of body shapes and structures are possible. On land, there are strict limits to how large animals can be before their skeletons become too weak to support their weight, or before their muscles cannot generate enough force to move their bulk. Limits that have constrained the maximum size of terrestrial animals throughout evolutionary history. But in water, these limits are relaxed, for water is dense enough to provide substantial buoyant support, effectively making animals weightless, or nearly so, allowing them to grow larger without needing proportionally stronger skeletons or muscles. This is why the largest animals on Earth, the blue whales and other great baleen whales, are aquatic rather than terrestrial, for water allows them to reach sizes that would be completely impossible on land. For invertebrates, which generally have weaker structural materials than vertebrates, being delicate compared to bone, the buoyancy provided by seawater is especially important, for it allows them to build relatively lightweight exoskeletons or shells that would collapse under their own weight on land. But that function perfectly well when supported by water. In the Antarctic, where the cold, dense water provides even more buoyant support than warmer, less dense water, this advantage is magnified slightly. Though the effect is small, perhaps a few % difference in buoyancy between cold and warm water. Nevertheless, every advantage helps, and the combination of high buoyancy, high oxygen, slow metabolism, and reduced predation creates an environment where invertebrates can grow to sizes that push the boundaries of what is possible for animals without internal skeletons. The gigantic amphipods. As we continue our slow exploration of Antarctic gigantism, let us now observe one of the most dramatic examples: the giant amphipods that swim and crawl through these frigid waters. Some of them reaching sizes that make them look like miniature lobsters, despite being much more closely related to the tiny beach hoppers and freshwater scuds that most people have encountered. Amphipods are crustaceans, like shrimp and crabs and isopods. but they are typically small, usually less than a centimeter or two in length, compressed laterally so that they look like they have been squeezed from the sides, making them taller than they are wide. They are found in nearly every aquatic environment on Earth, from freshwater streams to the deepest ocean trenches, and they occupy a wide variety of ecological niches. Some as scavengers, some as predators, some as herbivores grazing on algae. In the Antarctic, several species of amphipods have evolved into giants, with Alicella gigantea reaching lengths of up to 10 centimeters and Eurythenes gryllus and related species growing even larger in some cases. These giant amphipods are often predators or scavengers, feeding on dead whales and seals that sink to the seafloor after death, descending on the carcasses in vast numbers and stripping them clean over the course of weeks or months. Working like an army of tiny butchers to process the enormous amount of organic matter that such a carcass represents. The feeding behavior of giant amphipods is frenzied compared to the usual slow pace of Antarctic life. For when a fresh carcass is discovered, the amphipods swarm over it, tearing away chunks of flesh and fat with their sharp mandibles. Their normally slow movements accelerating to take advantage of the windfall. This ability to switch between long periods of fasting and brief periods of intense feeding is an important adaptation to the Antarctic environment, where food is often scarce, but occasionally becomes superabundant. And animals that can rapidly consume large amounts when food is available and then survive for long periods on stored reserves are at an advantage. The deep sea connection. Let us pause in our descent now and consider a broader pattern. The fact that gigantism is not unique to the Antarctic, but is also seen in the deep sea, in the cold, dark waters that cover most of the ocean floor at depths below about 1,000 meters. Deep sea gigantism is well documented, with giant amphipods, giant isopods, giant squid, and many other oversized creatures inhabiting the abyss. And the parallels between deep sea gigantism and Antarctic gigantism are striking, suggesting that they share common causes. Both environments are characterized by near freezing temperatures, high oxygen levels relative to warmer, shallower waters, low metabolic rates in the animals that live there, and relatively low predation pressure compared to more diverse ecosystems. Both environments also tend to have low and patchy food availability, with long periods of scarcity interrupted by occasional large pulses of food, such as when a whale carcass sinks from the surface, or when a phytoplankton bloom in the Antarctic summer rains organic matter down onto the seafloor. The deep sea and the Antarctic are, in many ways, similar habitats, despite being geographically separate. And the fact that both produce giant invertebrates suggests that the underlying mechanisms driving gigantism are related to these shared environmental characteristics rather than to anything specific to one location. This connection between Antarctic and deep sea gigantism is an active area of research, with scientists working to understand exactly which factors are most important in enabling large body sizes and whether the mechanisms are identical in the two environments or merely similar. Some researchers have proposed that the combination of high oxygen and low temperature is the critical factor, creating conditions where the constraints on oxygen delivery that normally limit size are relaxed enough to allow much larger body sizes to evolve. Others emphasize the importance of food availability patterns and predation pressure, suggesting that the unpredictable feast or famine nature of food supply in both environments favors larger body sizes because larger animals can store more energy and survive longer between meals, while reduced predation removes one of the main costs of being large: thermoregulation and energy balance. Drifting deeper into our understanding, let us now consider the challenges of living in water that is perpetually near freezing. Water so cold that it would quickly kill most organisms from warmer environments, and how Antarctic animals have adapted to maintain their internal processes at these extreme temperatures. Unlike mammals and birds, which are endothermic and maintain constant high body temperatures by generating heat internally, Most Antarctic marine animals are ectothermic, meaning their body temperature matches the temperature of the surrounding water. This presents both challenges and advantages. The challenge is that at temperatures near 0 degrees Celsius, many biological processes become extremely slow or stop entirely, and the lipids that make up cell membranes can become too rigid, losing their fluidity and their ability to regulate what passes in and out of cells. The advantage is that ectothermic animals do not need to expend energy maintaining a high body temperature, which would be extremely costly in such cold water where heat loss to the environment would be rapid and continuous. Antarctic ectotherms have evolved numerous adaptations to cope with the cold. Modifications at the molecular and cellular level that allow their bodies to function at temperatures that would be lethal to their warm water relatives. One of the most important adaptations is the production of antifreeze proteins, specialized molecules that bind to ice crystals and prevent them from growing, keeping the animal's body fluids liquid even at temperatures below the normal freezing point. These antifreeze proteins are found in the blood and other body fluids of many Antarctic fish and some invertebrates, and they are so effective that fish can swim in water at -2 degrees Celsius without freezing solid, their body fluids remaining liquid and functional despite being supercooled. Another adaptation is the modification of cell membrane lipids to include more unsaturated fats, which remain fluid at lower temperatures than the saturated fats typical of warm water organisms, ensuring that cell membranes continue to function properly even in the extreme cold. Enzymes, the proteins that catalyze chemical reactions in cells, have also been modified in Antarctic animals with amino acid substitutions that allow the enzymes to function efficiently at low temperatures, compensating to some degree for the overall slowdown of chemical reaction rates in the cold. The colossal squid. Let us now ascend slightly from the seafloor and drift through the open water column, the vast three-dimensional space between the surface and the bottom, and consider one of the most impressive examples of Antarctic gigantism. An animal that has captured human imagination for centuries despite being rarely seen, the colossal squid, Mesonychoteuthis hamiltoni, the largest known invertebrate on Earth by mass. The colossal squid inhabits the deep waters around Antarctica, typically at depths of several hundred to several thousand meters, where it hunts fish and other squid in the darkness, using enormous eyes, the largest eyes in the animal kingdom, to detect the faint bioluminescence produced by its prey. An adult colossal squid can reach lengths of 12 to 14 meters, including its tentacles, and can weigh as much as 500 kilograms or more, making it a true giant of the deep sea. Its body is robust and muscular, built more heavily than its relative the giant squid, which is longer but more slender, and its tentacles are armed with hooks as well as suckers, sharp rotating hooks that can rotate and pierce the flesh of prey, holding it securely while the squid's powerful beak tears it apart. The colossal squid's eyes are the size of dinner plates, up to 30 centimeters in diameter, and they are equipped with specialized light organs that may help illuminate prey or confuse predators. Though much about this animal's behavior remains mysterious because living specimens have never been observed in their natural habitat. What we know about colossal squid comes primarily from specimens that have been caught accidentally by fishing vessels or found in the stomachs of sperm whales, which are known to hunt these giant squid in the deep Antarctic waters. The colossal squid exemplifies many of the themes we have been exploring, living in cold, deep water where oxygen is plentiful and metabolic rates are slow, where large size may help in avoiding predators or in capturing large prey, and where the buoyancy of seawater and the absence of gravity's full weight allow an invertebrate to reach sizes that would be impossible on land. The challenges of studying Antarctic giants. As we continue to drift through these cold waters, let us take a moment to consider the practical difficulties that scientists face when studying Antarctic gigantism. For understanding these animals requires working in one of the most remote and inhospitable environments on Earth. The Southern Ocean surrounding Antarctica is vast and largely inaccessible. Covered by ice for much of the year, subject to storms and massive waves, and so far from any major population centers that simply reaching the study area requires weeks of travel by research vessel. Once there, scientists face the challenge of working in water that is cold enough to cause hypothermia within minutes without proper protection, in an environment where conditions can change rapidly and dangerously. Collecting specimens from the deep sea floor requires specialized equipment, remotely operated vehicles or trawls that can withstand the pressure and cold of the deep ocean. And even when specimens are successfully collected, keeping them alive for study is difficult because they are adapted to constant cold temperatures and cannot tolerate the temperature fluctuations that might occur during transport or in aquarium facilities. Many Antarctic giants have never been observed alive in their natural habitats, known only from specimens collected by trawls or dredges that bring them to the surface dead or dying. And so our understanding of their behavior, their feeding ecology, their interactions with other species remains incomplete and based largely on inference from anatomy and from observations of related species. In recent years, advances in technology have begun to change this, with remotely operated vehicles equipped with high-definition cameras, allowing scientists to observe Antarctic seafloor communities without disturbing them. And with improved aquarium systems that can maintain stable cold temperatures, allowing some species to be kept alive for study. But much remains to be learned. The challenges of working in Antarctica also mean that research proceeds slowly, with field seasons limited to the Antarctic summer when ice conditions are most favorable, and with each expedition requiring years of planning and substantial funding, so that progress in understanding Antarctic ecosystems is measured in decades rather than years. Evolutionary time and the cooling of Antarctica. Let us now drift backward through time, imagining the history of the Southern Ocean and how the modern Antarctic marine fauna came to exist in its current form. For the cold waters that surround Antarctica today have not always been so cold, and the giants that inhabit them are the products of millions of years of evolution in response to gradually changing conditions. Antarctica was not always frozen, not always the ice-covered continent we know today, but was once part of the supercontinent Gondwana, positioned farther north and enjoying a much warmer climate, with forests and rivers and a fauna that included dinosaurs and early mammals. As the continents drifted apart through the process of plate tectonics, Antarctica moved southward, eventually centering over the South Pole, and as it did so, ocean currents began to change. Around 34 million years ago, the Drake Passage opened between Antarctica and South America, and the Scotia Arc completed, allowing the establishment of the Antarctic Circumpolar Current, a massive current that flows eastward around Antarctica, isolating it from warmer waters to the north and creating a thermal barrier that keeps the Southern Ocean cold. With this current in place, Antarctica began to cool dramatically. Ice sheets formed and expanded, and the marine environment transitioned from temperate to polar. From waters that were relatively warm and productive to the frigid, oxygen-rich environment we see today. Many species went extinct during this cooling, unable to adapt to the changing conditions. But the ancestors of today's Antarctic giants survived. And over millions of years they evolved the adaptations necessary to thrive in the cold, including the ability to grow to large sizes. This evolutionary process was gradual, not something that happened overnight, but rather the result of countless generations of natural selection, favoring individuals that could cope with lower temperatures, that could take advantage of the high oxygen levels, that could survive on the patchy food resources typical of polar environments. The Antarctic marine fauna we see today is thus a product of this long history, a collection of species that have been shaped by millions of years of evolution in cold water. And their gigantism is not an accident, but an adaptive response to the specific environmental conditions of the Southern Ocean. Seasonal cycles and the midnight sun. As we drift through the Antarctic waters, experiencing the unchanging cold and darkness of the deep ocean, let us remember that above us, at the surface, conditions are not constant but change dramatically with the seasons, oscillating between extremes of light and darkness that have profound effects on the entire marine ecosystem. Antarctica experiences the most extreme seasonal light cycles on Earth, with the sun remaining above the horizon for months during the summer, creating a period of continuous daylight, often called the midnight sun, and then disappearing below the horizon for months during the winter, creating a period of continuous darkness called the polar night. During the summer, when sunlight is continuous and the ice retreats, phytoplankton bloom in the surface waters, photosynthesizing rapidly and building up large populations that support the entire marine food web. From tiny zooplankton that graze on the phytoplankton to krill that eat both phytoplankton and zooplankton, to fish and squid and seals and whales that feed on krill and on each other. This summer bloom is a time of abundance, when food is plentiful and when animals that have been surviving on stored reserves through the winter can feed intensively, rebuilding their energy stores and producing offspring. But the summer is brief, lasting only a few months, and as autumn approaches and the sun begins to set for the last time until spring, productivity plummets. The phytoplankton die back, and the surface waters become desert-like in their scarcity of food. During the winter, the long polar night means no photosynthesis can occur, and animals must survive on whatever energy they stored during the summer, or on the small amounts of food that rain down from the surface as dead organic matter. This extreme seasonality has shaped the life histories of Antarctic animals, favoring species that can survive long periods without food, that can store energy efficiently, and that can time their reproduction to coincide with the brief summer period when food is abundant, ensuring that their offspring hatch or are born when they have the best chance of finding enough to eat. The Antarctic Krill Foundation let us focus now on one of the most important animals in the Antarctic ecosystem. Not one of the giants we have been discussing, but a relatively small creature that forms the foundation of the entire Antarctic food web, the Antarctic krill, Euphausia superba, a shrimp-like crustacean that occurs in such enormous numbers that its total biomass may exceed that of any other animal species on Earth. Antarctic krill are small, typically only about 6 centimeters long as adults, but they live in vast swarms that can contain millions or billions of individuals. Aggregations so dense that the water appears pink with their bodies, and that can extend for kilometers in every direction. These swarms are one of the great spectacles of the Antarctic Ocean, though they occur mostly beneath the surface where humans rarely see them. Massive living clouds of crustaceans that move through the water in coordinated patterns, feeding on phytoplankton and on the small zooplankton that graze alongside them. Krill are the primary food source for most of Antarctica's iconic animals. Baleen whales that can eat several tons of krill per day, penguins that dive deep to catch krill and bring them back to their chicks, seals that hunt krill in the water column, and countless species of fish and squid and seabirds that depend on krill for their survival. The abundance of krill is directly linked to the productivity of the Southern Ocean, to the summer phytoplankton blooms that provide the food krill need to grow and reproduce. And krill populations fluctuate from year to year depending on environmental conditions, particularly the extent of sea ice, which provides habitat for the algae that young krill feed on during their first winter. In a good year, krill populations can be enormous, supporting large numbers of predators, but in a poor year when ice is scarce or summer blooms are weak, krill numbers decline and the entire ecosystem feels the effects. With whales and seals and penguins struggling to find enough food and often failing to reproduce successfully. This dependence on a single species makes the Antarctic ecosystem particularly vulnerable to environmental changes that affect krill, such as ocean warming or changes in ice extent. For if krill populations collapse, the entire food web could unravel, with cascading effects on every species from the smallest fish to the largest whales. Sponges and the slow life of filter feeders, descending once again to the seafloor. Let us turn our attention to a group of animals that embody the slow pace of Antarctic life more than perhaps any other. The sponges, simple animals that live attached to rocks and that filter feed on tiny particles suspended in the water, and that can live for centuries in the cold Antarctic waters. Sponges are among the simplest of all animals, lacking organs, lacking a nervous system, lacking even tissues in the way that more complex animals have them. Instead, existing as colonies of cells loosely organized around a system of pores and channels through which water flows. They are filter feeders, pumping water through their bodies and extracting tiny food particles, bacteria and phytoplankton and organic detritus from the water as it passes through. In warm waters, sponges grow relatively quickly, pumping large volumes of water and processing food rapidly. But in the Antarctic, sponges live in slow motion, their metabolism reduced to a crawl by the cold. Their growth so slow that it can take decades for a sponge to grow to the size of a basketball. Some Antarctic sponges are thought to be hundreds or even thousands of years old. Ancient individuals that have been filtering the waters of the Southern Ocean since long before humans began exploring these regions. These sponges can grow to impressive sizes, with some species forming massive structures over a meter tall, their bodies providing habitat for countless other organisms, small crustaceans and worms, and brittle stars that live among the sponge's tissues or hide in its folds. The slow growth of Antarctic sponges makes them particularly vulnerable to disturbance. For if a sponge is damaged or destroyed by a trawl or anchor or ice scour, it can take many decades or even centuries for the community to recover, to rebuild to its previous state. This fragility highlights the importance of protecting Antarctic marine ecosystems from human impacts. For the slow pace of life in these waters means that damage can persist for much longer than it would in faster-paced, warmer ecosystems, where organisms grow and reproduce more rapidly. The role of temperature in enzyme function. Let us drift now into the molecular realm, considering how life at the cellular and molecular level adapts to function in the extreme cold of Antarctic waters. For it is at this fundamental level that the constraints of temperature are most directly felt, and where some of the most elegant adaptations have evolved. All of life's processes are carried out by proteins, large complex molecules made of chains of amino acids folded into precise three-dimensional shapes. And among the most important proteins are enzymes, molecules that catalyze chemical reactions, speeding them up by factors of millions or billions and making possible the chemistry of life. Enzymes work by binding to their substrate molecules, the chemicals they act upon, and stabilizing the transition state of the reaction, the high-energy intermediate configuration that molecules must pass through as they transform from reactants to products. The rate at which an enzyme can catalyze a reaction depends on temperature. For temperature affects both how quickly molecules move and collide with each other, and how much thermal energy is available to overcome the activation energy barrier of the reaction. In warm environments, enzymes can operate very efficiently, processing substrate molecules rapidly because thermal energy is abundant and molecular motion is fast. But in cold environments, enzymes slow down dramatically, their activity dropping by a factor of 2 or more for every 10-degree decrease in temperature. For Antarctic animals, this presents a fundamental problem. For if their enzymes operated at the same efficiency as those of warm water animals, Their metabolic rates would be so low that they might barely be able to function at all, unable to generate energy fast enough to support even basic life processes. The solution has been to evolve cold-adapted enzymes, proteins that have been fine-tuned through millions of years of natural selection to work efficiently at low temperatures. These cold-adapted enzymes typically have more flexible structures than their warm water counterparts, with looser active sites that can bind substrate molecules more easily, and with reduced stability that allows the protein to change shape more readily, compensating for the lack of thermal energy by making the enzyme more responsive to the substrate binding and more efficient at catalyzing the reaction, even when molecular motion is slow. Lipids and membrane fluidity. Continuing our exploration of molecular adaptations to cold, let us consider the cell membrane, the thin barrier that separates the interior of each cell from the external environment and that controls what passes in and out, regulating the flow of nutrients and waste products and maintaining the proper concentrations of ions and molecules needed for cellular function. The cell membrane is made primarily of lipids, fat-like molecules that form a bilayer. Two sheets of lipids arranged with their water-repelling tails pointing inward and their water-attracting heads pointing outward, creating a barrier that is impermeable to most water-soluble molecules, but that is fluid enough to allow proteins embedded in the membrane to move around and carry out their functions. The fluidity of the membrane is critical to its function, for if the membrane becomes too rigid, proteins cannot move and many cellular processes stop. But if it becomes too fluid, the membrane loses its integrity and the cell can leak or break apart. Temperature has a strong effect on membrane fluidity, with cold temperatures causing lipids to pack together more tightly and become more rigid, while warm temperatures increase molecular motion and make membranes more fluid. For Antarctic animals, maintaining proper membrane fluidity at temperatures near freezing requires adjusting the composition of membrane lipids, incorporating more unsaturated fatty acids, which have kinks in their molecular structure that prevent tight packing, and reducing the proportion of saturated fatty acids, which can pack tightly and form rigid structures. This adjustment is called homeoviscous adaptation, and it has been documented in many cold-adapted organisms, from Antarctic fish to bacteria living in polar seas, all of which show increased proportions of unsaturated lipids in their cell membranes compared to related species from warmer environments. The result is that even at near freezing temperatures, the cell membranes of Antarctic animals remain fluid and functional, allowing cells to carry out their normal activities despite the extreme cold. The Antarctic silverfish. Let us now drift through the water column and observe one of the most important fish in the Antarctic ecosystem, the Antarctic silverfish, Pleurogramma antarcticum, a small silvery fish that plays a role in Antarctic food webs analogous to that of krill, serving as a key prey species for seals and penguins and other predators. The Antarctic silverfish is one of the few fish species that spends its entire life in the open water, rather than on or near the seafloor, drifting with currents and feeding on zooplankton in the water column. And it has evolved remarkable adaptations to life in the extreme cold. One of the most notable is the presence of antifreeze proteins in its blood, glycoproteins that bind to ice crystals and prevent them from growing, allowing the fish to remain active in water at temperatures below the freezing point of pure water. These antifreeze proteins are so effective that they can keep the fish's blood liquid at temperatures as low as -2 degrees Celsius, and they work by a mechanism that is elegant in its simplicity. The proteins absorb onto the surface of tiny ice crystals that form in the blood and prevent additional water molecules from attaching, effectively poisoning the growth of ice and keeping the crystals small enough that they do not damage tissues or cause the blood to freeze solid. The Antarctic silverfish is also notable for its life history, which is closely tied to the seasonal cycles of the Antarctic Ocean. Spawning occurs in winter, when the fish lay their eggs beneath the sea ice, and the eggs are buoyant, rising to the underside of the ice where they attach and develop slowly over the course of several months. Hatching in spring when phytoplankton blooms begin and food becomes available for the larvae. This timing ensures that young fish have access to food during the critical early stages of their lives when they are most vulnerable to starvation. And it is an example of the fine-tuned adaptations that Antarctic species have evolved to cope with the extreme seasonality of their environment. Scale worms and chemosynthetic ecosystems. Let us now descend to one of the most unusual habitats in the Antarctic Ocean. The hydrothermal vents and cold seeps that occur along underwater volcanic ridges and in sediment basins. Places where fluids from beneath the seafloor emerge into the ocean, carrying dissolved chemicals that can be used as energy sources by specialized bacteria. These chemosynthetic bacteria form the base of food webs that are completely independent of sunlight. Ecosystems that thrive in total darkness and that support a variety of animals, including giant tube worms, clams, mussels, and scale worms. While hydrothermal vents are found throughout the world's oceans, those in the Antarctic are of particular interest because they exist at the intersection of two extreme environments: the high temperatures and unusual chemistry of the vent fluids and the near-freezing temperatures of the surrounding Antarctic water. Animals living at Antarctic vents must cope with both extremes simultaneously, and some of them show adaptations that are unique to this situation. The scale worms, or polynoid polychaetes that live on Antarctic vents, are particularly interesting examples of animals that thrive in these gradient environments. Moving between areas near the vent where temperatures can exceed 50 degrees Celsius and areas just centimeters away where temperatures are below zero. These scale worms are covered in overlapping plates called elytra that protect them from the harsh conditions, and they feed on bacteria growing on the vent surfaces or on other animals that inhabit the vent community. While most Antarctic animals are small due to the constraints of cold water metabolism, animals at hydrothermal vents, including those in the Antarctic, can grow relatively large because food is abundant, provided by the enormous productivity of chemosynthetic bacteria that can convert the chemicals in vent fluids into organic matter with great efficiency, supporting dense communities of animals in environments where photosynthesis-based food webs cannot exist. Ecological interactions and competition. As we drift through the Antarctic ecosystem, observing the giants and the small, the fast and the slow, let us consider how these animals interact with each other. How competition for resources and predation and symbiosis shape the structure of communities in these cold waters. In many ecosystems, competition for resources like food and space is intense, driving evolution of specialized niches and resource partitioning. Where different species use slightly different resources or feed at different times or places to avoid competing directly with each other. In the Antarctic, where food is often scarce and where the slow pace of life means that populations recover slowly from disturbances, competition might be expected to be particularly important. But in practice, it is difficult to study, and its role in shaping Antarctic communities is not fully understood. What is clear is that the extreme seasonality of the Antarctic Ocean creates a temporal niche structure, with different species timing their reproduction and growth to take advantage of the brief summer pulse of productivity, and with many species spending the long winter in a state of reduced activity, living on stored reserves and waiting for the return of abundant food. Predation is another important interaction, shaping the size, structure, and behavior of prey populations and influencing where and when animals are active. Some Antarctic predators, like leopard seals and orcas, are highly mobile and can hunt over large areas, while others, like sea anemones and predatory sea stars, are sessile or slow-moving and must wait for prey to come to them. The presence of these predators influences the behavior of prey species, causing them to avoid certain areas or to be active only at certain times when predation risk is lower. And these behavioral responses can have cascading effects on the entire community structure, affecting which species are abundant and where they are found. The future of Antarctic giants in a warming ocean. As we continue to drift through these cold waters, we must also look toward the future and consider what might happen to Antarctic giants and to the entire Southern Ocean ecosystem as the global climate warms and as human activities increasingly affect even the most remote parts of the planet. The Southern Ocean is warming, with water temperatures rising measurably over the past few decades. And sea ice extent is declining, particularly in the Antarctic Peninsula region where warming has been most pronounced. These changes are already affecting Antarctic ecosystems, with shifts in the distributions of species, changes in the timing of phytoplankton blooms, and declines in some populations of krill and other key species. For Antarctic giants, which have evolved over millions of years to thrive in water that is perpetually near freezing, warming temperatures represent a fundamental challenge to their existence. For their metabolic adaptations are finely tuned to the cold and may not function as well in warmer water. If temperatures rise by even a few degrees, the oxygen advantage that allows Antarctic animals to grow so large may be diminished. For warmer water holds less dissolved oxygen and increases metabolic rates, potentially squeezing Antarctic giants from both sides by reducing oxygen availability while increasing oxygen demand. Additionally, warming may allow species from more temperate waters to invade the Antarctic, bringing with them diseases and parasites that Antarctic species have never encountered and to which they may have no resistance, and introducing new predators and competitors that could disrupt the delicate balance of Antarctic ecosystems. The loss of sea ice is another major concern. For ice is critical habitat for many Antarctic species, providing a platform for seals to rest and give birth, a substrate for the algae that young krill depend on, and a protective barrier that moderates the effects of storms and waves on coastal communities. As ice declines, these habitats are lost, and species that depend on them may decline as well, with cascading effects throughout the food web. Human impacts and conservation beyond climate change. Antarctic ecosystems face other human impacts that threaten their integrity and the survival of the unique species that inhabit them. Commercial fishing in the Southern Ocean targets species like Antarctic toothfish and icefish. And while these fisheries are regulated by international agreements through the Commission for the Conservation of Antarctic Marine Living Resources, illegal and unregulated fishing remains a problem. And even legal fishing can have impacts on non-target species through bycatch, the unintended capture of animals like seabirds and seals in fishing gear. Bottom trawling, which drags heavy nets across the sea floor to catch fish. And invertebrates is particularly destructive in Antarctic waters because it damages the slow-growing communities of sponges and corals and other sessile organisms that take decades or centuries to recover from disturbance. Tourism is also increasing in the Antarctic, with tens of thousands of tourists visiting each year on cruise ships and expedition vessels. And while tourism can help build public support for conservation, it also brings risks of pollution, of disturbance to wildlife, and of accidental introduction of invasive species. Scientific research itself, while essential for understanding Antarctic ecosystems and for informing conservation efforts, can have local impacts, with research stations generating waste and pollution, and with the collection of specimens for study, reducing populations of rare or slow-growing species. Balancing these various human activities with the need to protect Antarctic ecosystems is a major challenge, requiring international cooperation and strong enforcement of regulations. For Antarctica is a global commons, not owned by any single nation, but held in trust for all humanity under the Antarctic Treaty System, and its protection depends on the collective will of the international community to prioritize conservation over short-term economic interests. The wonder of adaptation. As we begin to rise slowly from the depths, ascending gently back toward the surface and toward the end of our journey, let us take a moment to reflect on the wonder of adaptation, on the incredible diversity of solutions that evolution has found to the challenge of living in the extreme cold of Antarctic waters. From antifreeze proteins that prevent ice crystals from forming in blood, to cold-adapted enzymes that function efficiently at temperatures that would shut down the metabolism of most organisms, to membrane lipids that remain fluid at near freezing temperatures, to slow life histories that stretch growth and reproduction over decades rather than months. Antarctic animals embody the power of natural selection to shape organisms to their environments. The giants we have explored, the sea spiders and isopods and amphipods and snails and squid that reach sizes unheard of in warmer waters, are testaments to how environmental conditions can push evolution in unexpected directions, creating forms and life histories that seem strange to us, but that are perfectly suited to the cold, oxygen-rich waters of the Southern Ocean. These animals remind us that life is far more diverse and adaptable than we often appreciate, that organisms can thrive in conditions that seem impossibly harsh to human sensibilities, and that the natural world is full of wonders that we are only beginning to understand. Each Antarctic giant is a product of millions of years of evolutionary history, a living connection to past climates and past oceans, and each carries within its body and its genes a record of that history. Information that scientists are only now learning to read and interpret. By studying these animals, we learn not just about them, but about the fundamental principles of biology, about how organisms solve problems, about how ecosystems function, about how life itself is possible in extreme environments. The deep silence of the Antarctic Ocean as we continue our ascent, rising slowly through the dark water column, let us appreciate the profound silence of the Antarctic Ocean. The quietness that pervades these depths where human voices never penetrate and where the sounds that do exist, the clicks of shrimp, the calls of seals, the creaking of ice, are swallowed by the vastness of water. This silence is part of what makes the Antarctic so special, so different from the noisy, cluttered environments where most humans live. And it is something worth protecting. For underwater noise from ships and other human activities can disrupt the communication and behavior of marine animals, particularly whales and seals that rely on sound to navigate and find food and communicate with each other over long distances. In the silence of the Antarctic Ocean, undisturbed by human activity, these animals can live as they have for millions of years, their sounds carrying for hundreds of kilometers through the cold, dense water, creating an acoustic landscape that we are only beginning to appreciate and understand. The silence also invites contemplation, invites us to slow down and think deeply about our place in the natural world, about our responsibilities to protect and preserve ecosystems that do not belong to us, but that we have the power to damage or destroy. As we rise higher, the water around us begins to lighten, faint hints of sunlight filtering down from above. And we know that we are approaching the surface, leaving behind the deep, dark world of Antarctic giants and returning to the world of air and light where humans live. But before we break the surface, let us carry with us the memories of what we have seen. The slow-moving sea spiders stepping carefully across the sea floor, the giant isopods scavenging in the darkness, the colossal squid drifting through the abyss, the silverfish gliding through the water column with antifreeze in their blood, all of them living their slow, patient lives in the coldest waters on Earth. All of them adapted in remarkable ways to conditions that would kill most other animals within minutes. The interconnectedness of Antarctic life. As we near the surface, let us consider one final important concept: the interconnectedness of Antarctic life. The way that every species in these ecosystems is linked to every other species through food webs and nutrient cycles and habitat relationships. The phytoplankton that bloom in the summer depend on nutrients brought up from the deep ocean by mixing and upwelling. Nutrients that were originally incorporated into the bodies of animals and bacteria and that were released back into the water when those organisms died and decayed. The krill that eat the phytoplankton are themselves eaten by fish and squid and seals and whales. And when those predators die, their bodies sink to the seafloor where they are consumed by scavengers like amphipods and isopods and sea stars, which in turn are eaten by larger predators or eventually die themselves. Their nutrients being taken up by bacteria and returned to the water column, completing the cycle. This interconnectedness means that changes to one part of the ecosystem, loss of ice, decline in krill, warming of water, can have far-reaching effects throughout the entire system, affecting species and processes that seem unrelated, but that are in fact tightly coupled. It also means that protecting Antarctic ecosystems requires a holistic approach, not just protecting individual species or specific areas, but managing human activities in ways that maintain the integrity of the entire ecosystem, preserving the physical and chemical conditions that Antarctic life depends on and preventing disruptions to the complex web of interactions that sustains these communities. The Antarctic Ocean is not just a collection of individual animals living in cold water, but a functioning ecosystem. A community of organisms and their environment interacting in ways that have been shaped by millions of years of evolution and that create emergent properties, behaviors, and patterns that arise from the interactions of many components, and that cannot be understood by studying those components in isolation. The poetry of ice and water. We are very close to the surface now, and as we prepare to break through into the air above, let us appreciate the beauty of the Antarctic environment, not just the biological beauty of the animals we have explored, but the physical beauty of ice and water and light. The way that icebergs glow blue from within, where light has penetrated deep into the compressed ice and been scattered by the crystals. The way that ice shelves calve into the ocean with thunderous crashes that echo for kilometers across the still water. The way that auroras dance in the winter sky above the frozen continent. Curtains of green and red light created by solar particles colliding with the atmosphere. Phenomena of pure physics and chemistry that have no biological function, but that inspire awe and wonder nonetheless. The Antarctic is a place where the grand processes of the Earth system, the circulation of oceans, the movement of ice, the cycling of carbon and other elements, are visible and tangible, where humans can see and feel the power of natural forces that shape our planet. It is also a place that has inspired explorers and scientists and artists for centuries. A landscape of extremes that challenges human endurance and ingenuity, that reveals the limits of what we can understand and control. And that reminds us that there are still wild places on Earth, places where nature dominates and where human influence, though growing, has not yet overwhelmed the natural systems that have existed for millions of years. As we think about the giants of the Antarctic Ocean, the enormous invertebrates and fish that thrive in the cold, we can see them not just as curiosities, not just as scientific puzzles to be solved, but as symbols of the resilience and adaptability of life. As reminders that evolution has no foresight, no plan, but nevertheless produces solutions of elegant complexity to the challenges posed by environments of every kind. Bringing the Antarctic home. As we break the surface and take a breath of cold Antarctic air, let us consider what we can take home from this journey. What lessons the Antarctic giants can teach us about life and adaptation and conservation. One lesson is that size is not destiny. That being small does not mean being unsuccessful, and being large does not guarantee survival. For success in evolution is measured only by reproductive success, by passing genes to the next generation. And this can be achieved through many different strategies, small and fast. Reproducing in some environments, large and slow growing in others. Another lesson is that environments shape organisms in profound ways. That the temperature of water or the availability of oxygen or the patterns of food supply are not mere background conditions, but fundamental factors that determine what is possible, what forms life can take, and what sizes organisms can reach, and what behaviors they can exhibit. A third lesson is that ecosystems are complex and fragile. That the removal of one species or the alteration of one physical condition can have cascading effects throughout the entire system. And that protecting biodiversity requires protecting not just the organisms themselves, but the environments they live in and the processes that sustain those environments. As humans, we have the power to affect ecosystems everywhere on Earth, even in the most remote places like the Antarctic Ocean. And with that power comes responsibility. The responsibility to understand the consequences of our actions and to make choices that minimize harm and preserve the natural world for future generations. The giants of the Antarctic remind us that the world is full of wonders, that there are animals living in ways we never imagined, in places we rarely think about, and that these animals have value, not just for what they can teach us about biology or what resources they might provide, but simply for existing, for being part of the rich tapestry of life on Earth. The slow settling into rest. As our journey through the Antarctic Ocean comes to a close, and as you lie there in the comfort of your bed or chair, let yourself settle more deeply into rest. Let your breathing slow even further. Let your muscles relax completely. Let your thoughts drift like snowflakes falling on water, gently coming to rest and dissolving into the depths. The images of giant sea spiders and colossal squid, of slow-moving isopods and ancient sponges, can fade now, becoming dreamlike and indistinct, blending into the peaceful darkness behind your eyelids. There is no need to remember every detail, no need to hold on to the facts and figures we have explored together, for the information is always there if you need it, recorded in books and papers and websites. But for now, in this moment, you can simply let it all go. Let it sink into your subconscious, where it will be processed and integrated while you sleep. The Antarctic Ocean will still be there tomorrow, still cold, still full of giants, still mysterious and beautiful. But tomorrow is not now. And now is the time for rest. For letting your body and mind recover from the day. For allowing sleep to come naturally and easily, like a tide rising gently on a shore. Feel the weight of your body sinking into the mattress or cushions beneath you. Feel yourself being supported completely, with no effort required, no tension needed. Just the simple sensation of being held by the surface beneath you, solid and reliable and comfortable. Your breathing is slow and steady now, each breath coming without thought, flowing in and out like waves. And with each exhale, you let go a little more, releasing any remaining tension, any lingering thoughts about tasks undone, or worries about tomorrow, just breathing and being, existing in this peaceful moment, drifting into the deep quiet. Let yourself drift now, like a particle of marine snow sinking slowly through the water column, turning and tumbling gently as it descends through layers of increasingly dark and quiet water, leaving behind the bright surface with its waves and wind and moving down into the still calm depths where nothing disturbs the eternal peace. You are warm and comfortable, safe and relaxed. And there is nowhere you need to be, nothing you need to do, just this gentle drifting downward into sleep, into the deep quiet where the Antarctic giants live, where time moves slowly and where patience is the only virtue that matters. The cold, dark waters of the Southern Ocean are far away now, on the other side of the world. But the sense of peace they embody, the slowness and silence and simplicity, is here with you, wrapping around you like a blanket, insulating you from the noise and stress of ordinary life, creating a space where you can simply be at rest. As you sink deeper into sleep, your awareness of the external world fades, the sounds of the room becoming distant and unimportant, the feeling of the sheets and blankets becoming part of you rather than separate objects. Your body and your environment merging into a single, undifferentiated sense of comfortable existence. Dreams may come, images of ice and water, of strange creatures moving through darkness, of vast empty spaces where silence reigns. And these dreams are fine. They are part of the natural process of sleep. Your mind processing the information and experiences of the day, creating stories and scenarios that have no particular meaning, but that serve the important function of consolidating memories and maintaining neural health. Or perhaps there will be no dreams, just the deep, blank, restorative sleep that your body needs. The kind of sleep where hours pass in what feels like moments, and where you wake feeling refreshed and restored, ready to face whatever challenges the new day might bring. Either way is fine. There is no right or wrong way to sleep, no correct way to dream or not dream. Just the natural unfolding of the processes that have sustained animal life for hundreds of millions of years. Processes that the Antarctic giants also experience, in their own slow way as they rest on the seafloor or drift in the water column. Their metabolism slowed even further during periods of inactivity, their bodies conserving energy and maintaining themselves with minimal effort. Before the new chapters, one quiet accuracy note. Your draft is broadly aligned with real Antarctic science in tone and direction, but a few specific claims would be safer if softened or corrected. For example, the amphipod Alicella gigantea is famously associated with the deep sea rather than being an Antarctic specialist. So in your Chapter 13 showpiece line, it would be better framed as deep sea and polar adjacent gigantism, rather than purely Antarctic amphipods, or swap in a clearly Southern Ocean example without naming Alicella. Also, the line that Antarctic krill may exceed that of any other animal species on Earth is sometimes repeated in popular science, but it's hard to treat as a settled, precisely provable claim. It will feel more accurate if you phrase it as among the largest biomasses on Earth, rather than the single largest. The slow breath of the Southern Ocean. Imagine for a moment that the ocean itself is breathing, not in quick breaths the way we do, not in anxious little sips of air, but in an ancient rhythm that takes its time, a breath that might last a season or a year or longer. The Southern Ocean does something like this. It inhales and exhales through currents, through mixing, through the quiet movement of water masses that slide beneath each other like layers of silk. And if you listen to this idea gently, without trying to pin it down too sharply, you can feel how perfectly it matches the creatures we have been visiting. Antarctic gigantism is not only about bodies becoming large. It is about life learning to move at the pace of the environment, learning to fit itself into a world where nothing is rushed, where the cold persuades chemistry to slow down, where the year is carved into bright abundance and long darkness, where growth is measured not in weeks, but in decades. In warmer seas, the ocean can feel restless. The surface is busy with evaporation and storms. The shallows are full of motion, the food web churns quickly. But here, in the far south, there is a different kind of restlessness. One that looks still from a human point of view, but is powerful in its own quiet way. Cold water holds oxygen more easily, and the chemistry of life takes advantage of that, as if the sea has offered a deeper reservoir of breath. When you picture an Antarctic sea spider standing delicately on the seafloor, its long legs spread like thin branches of winter trees, you can imagine oxygen slipping through the boundary between water and body, a slow, constant gift. When you picture a giant isopod moving like a small armored submarine across sediment, tasting the water with its antenna, you can imagine that same oxygen banked around it, dissolved and ready, making patience possible. But oxygen is only one part of the breath. The other part is food, and the way food arrives here like a soft snowfall. We used the phrase marine snow earlier, and it is such a gentle metaphor that it almost feels made for sleep. Tiny particles, the leftovers of life above, drifting down through darkness, turning slowly as they fall. In most oceans, that snowfall is constant in a busy way, always replenished by sunlight and plankton. In the Antarctic, it is seasonal. Summer floods the surface with light, phytoplankton bloom, krill gather, and the entire ecosystem briefly becomes louder and more crowded in its own underwater way. Then winter returns, and the system draws inward, conserving. It is like a long exhale. Life slows, and bodies live on reserves, on the stored energy of fat and muscle and tissue built patiently during the bright months. This is where large size becomes not just possible, but useful. A bigger body is a library of stored energy. It is a pantry. It is a slow-burning candle rather than a spark. In a feast or famine world, the candle is reliable. It can keep a small flame alive for a long time. That is one of the quiet secrets behind many forms of gigantism in cold or deep environments. The ability to endure gaps, to remain functional through scarcity, to wait without failing. If you let your mind drift through the Southern Ocean now, you might picture the water column as a tall, dim cathedral. The roof is the underside of sea ice, pale and shifting, with algae clinging to it like a faint green stain of life. The middle is twilight, where krills swarm when the season allows, where fish move like whispers, where the occasional squid passes through like a long, slow thought. And the floor is the benthic world, where sponges can live for centuries, filtering the same water again and again, not hurrying, not needing to. It is a place where time behaves differently, as if the cold has thickened it. And then, very gently, we can widen the lens even further, beyond any single creature. Gigantism is often presented as a strange trick of nature, a curiosity to point at. But in the calm light of reflection, it becomes something else. It becomes an example of how the universe expresses its rules in different tempos. The same physics applies everywhere. Surface area and volume still scale the way they always do. Oxygen still diffuses the way it always does. Chemical reactions still speed up with warmth and slow down with cold. Yet when the background conditions change, life explores the new shape of possibility. In warm places, life often becomes faster, more colorful, more frantic. In cold places, life often becomes steady, durable, and sometimes larger. There is a kind of philosophy hidden here that you do not need to chase. You can let it come to you the way sleep comes, without effort. The philosophy is that success does not have one look. The ocean does not reward only speed. It also rewards persistence. It rewards the ability to keep going quietly. A sponge that lives for centuries does not win by outcompeting in a sprint. It wins by simply continuing, by remaining present through storms, through changing seasons, through years when food is scarce, through years when it is plentiful. And if you hold that idea softly, you might feel it in your own body. You have made it through countless days by persistence, not by constant intensity. Your heart has beaten without applause. Your lungs have breathed without needing an audience. Your cells have repaired quietly. The Antarctic creatures we visited are not so different in spirit. Their lives are built on small, continuous acts of maintenance and patience. The cold, in a way, has taught them what your body already knows. Slow can be strong. Now picture as you rest, the Antarctic circumpolar current circling the continent like a belt of moving water, connecting oceans, carrying nutrients, isolating Antarctica in a ring of cold. Picture deep water rising in places, bringing ancient minerals upward, feeding blooms when the light returns. Picture the slow sinking of organic matter, returning those nutrients downward again. The system is a loop, a breathing cycle, an exchange. This is not just biology, it is choreography on a planetary scale. And somewhere in that choreography, a giant sea spider feeds, a giant isopod waits, a sea snail moves an inch, then another inch, then rests again, never forced into hurry. Somewhere, a colossal squid drifts through darkness with eyes like round windows, seeing what little can be seen, living in a world where distance is measured in pressure and silence. Somewhere, krill swarm in numbers so vast they feel like weather rather than animals, turning sunlight into life that will ripple upward into whales and penguins and seals. You do not have to hold all these images clearly. You can let them blur. Sleep does not ask for sharpness, it asks for softness. So let the Southern Ocean breathe in the background of your thoughts. Let it be a slow tide moving under the ice. Let it be a cold, oxygen-rich stillness. Let it be a place where giants exist not as monsters, but as patient shapes in the dark. Reminders that life can expand when time is generous. And as your breathing becomes slower, you can imagine your own breath joining that larger rhythm. Inhale, like the ocean drawing in cold water and oxygen. Exhale, like the ocean releasing a season, releasing the need to do anything at all. Inhale, quietly. Exhale, softly. The Southern Ocean breathes, and you are allowed to rest. A gentle last descent beneath the ice. Now, as the documentary's journey settles into its final quiet stretch, you can imagine one last descent. Not the kind of descent that feels dramatic or dangerous, but a gentle lowering. The way a feather falls through still air, the way a snowflake drifts toward the surface of dark water and disappears without sound. The ocean beneath Antarctic ice is like that. It does not ask you to fight it. It carries you. It accepts you. It makes room for you. In your mind's eye, you might return to the surface one more time, to the quiet ceiling of sea ice. The ice is not a single flat sheet, but a shifting mosaic of plates and ridges, pressed together and pulled apart by wind and current. Underneath it, the light is different. Even in daytime, it arrives muted, filtered, as if the world has placed a soft cloth over a lamp. In winter, it may not arrive at all. And yet the ocean does not feel empty. It feels contained, protected, like a room designed for sleep. As you drift downward, you pass through the first hints of life that make use of this strange overhead world. Algae clinging to the underside of ice, small creatures grazing, quiet beginnings, and you can sense, even without seeing, the way everything in the Antarctic system is timed to the return of light, to the brief season when the sun circles without setting, and the surface blooms in a rush of productivity. that burst of abundance is not frantic. It is simply concentrated. It is like a deep breath taken once and then used slowly for months. A little deeper, the world becomes twilight. The water grows darker, the colors fade, and you might feel as if you are entering the place where thoughts also fade, where the mind stops grabbing for edges. If you were here in a submersible with lights turned off, you would see almost nothing. You would instead feel the vastness. You would feel the thickness of water pressing gently against every surface, the way pressure becomes a quiet, constant presence as depth increases. This is the place where the ocean teaches one of its most comforting lessons. Darkness does not have to mean danger. Darkness can mean privacy. Darkness can mean calm. Darkness can mean that the world is no longer asking you to perform. Down here, there is no audience. There is no expectation. Life continues, but it does so without spectacle. And as you sink, you can think of the giants again. Not in sharp detail, but as impressions. The sea spider, legs spread wide, so much of its body distributed into thin branches that oxygen can pass through without elaborate machinery. The isopod, armored and deliberate, able to wait through long scarcity, to eat when food arrives and then return to stillness. The slow sea snail, moving as if motion itself is optional, as if the act of crossing the sea floor is a meditation rather than a task. In the daylight world above, being slow can feel like falling behind. But in the Antarctic, slowness is a strategy. It is a way to match the temperature, the oxygen, the food supply. It is a way to harmonize with a planet that turns steadily without caring about schedules. Slowness here is not failure. It is alignment. You might also sense, faintly, the other quiet truth, that much of what we have said is still unfolding in science. Antarctica is remote. The ocean there is difficult to study. Many creatures are known from rare encounters, from brief glimpses, from specimens brought up and studied far from their home. There is humility built into Antarctic research because the environment itself enforces patience. It does not allow constant observation. It does not allow quick certainty. It asks scientists to return again and again, season after season, and build knowledge slowly, like the growth of a sponge. And that humility fits the mood of sleep. Because sleep, too, is a kind of surrender to what you do not control. You cannot force it. You can only invite it. You can only create the conditions and then let the body do what it has evolved to do. So let the conditions become simpler now. Let the muscles around your eyes soften. Let the tongue rest in the mouth without tension. Let the shoulders melt downward. Let the breath become quiet enough that you can barely hear it. You might imagine that each exhale is a small sinking, a lowering into warmer comfort, even as the story speaks of cold water. The paradox is gentle. You are warm here, safe here, while you visit the coldest ocean on Earth in your mind. As the descent continues, you arrive at the sea floor. In your imagination, it is wide and dim, sometimes flat, sometimes rippled, sometimes dotted with rocks and the slow architecture of life. Perhaps you see sponges rising like ancient towers, filter feeding patiently, living for so long that a human lifetime would be a brief weather pattern to them. Perhaps you see brittle stars scattered like living ornaments. Perhaps you see soft corals holding their shape in the current. Everything here seems designed to last, and in the far distance of thought, you may sense the presence of the largest mystery shapes, like the colossal squid moving in open water, living mostly unseen, a reminder that even on Earth, even now, there are animals that remain partly unknown. That unknownness does not have to be unsettling. It can be comforting. It means the world is still bigger than our worries. It means there are stories continuing without us. Epilogue. A gentle farewell to the Antarctic. And so we come to the end of our journey through the cold waters of the Antarctic Ocean. Our exploration of why cold water makes animals huge. Our gentle drift through layers of biology and physics and ecology and evolution. The Antarctic giants, those remarkable oversized invertebrates and fish that thrive in conditions that would kill most other organisms, have shown us that life is adaptable beyond our usual comprehension, that evolution finds solutions to problems we would think unsolvable, that beauty and wonder exist in the most unlikely places, in the cold, dark depths where few humans will ever venture. As you rest now, drifting in that peaceful space between waking and sleeping, or perhaps already fully asleep, dreaming or not dreaming, let the knowledge that such places exist, that such animals thrive, be a source of comfort and fascination. A reminder that the world is larger and stranger and more wonderful than the small bubble of daily experience that most of us inhabit most of the time. The Antarctic Ocean, with its giants and its mysteries, will be there when you wake. Still cold, still dark, still full of life, adapted in amazing ways to extreme conditions. And perhaps someday you will think of it again. We'll remember the sea spiders and the isopods and the colossal squid. We'll recall that there are places on Earth where the rules seem different, where organisms live at the edges of what seems possible, where patience and slowness are not weaknesses but strengths, where the cold that would kill us is the very condition that allows giants to flourish. Sleep well now, rest deeply, and know that in the great southern ocean, beneath the ice and beyond the reach of human voices, life goes on in its slow, deliberate way, unaware of us and untroubled by our concerns, simply existing as it has for millions of years, a testament to the power and beauty of evolution and adaptation. A reminder that we are part of a living planet full of wonders we have barely begun to understand, and that this is enough. This is beautiful. This is worth protecting and preserving and marveling at as we drift off into our own gentle darkness, into sleep, into rest, into peace.